Thanks, everyone. My name is Chappell, like Mr. Chappell said. I represent a number of interest groups here at CUA, not the least of which is the first year experience. And I'd like to thank Taylor Fail, Philip Mai, and Dr. Lee for inviting me to be here today. I also represent the English department as an English instructor within the FYE and in other capacities. I represent Humanities. Humanities 101 people are here. I partially represent Crux. Crux people are here. And not the least of which is that I represent the Writing Center as their assistant director. So with all this in mind, I want to try to touch on as many of these interest groups as I can in my presentation today. Okay? Like any good writer, I prepared my remarks well in advance of today. But this is before I realized that we were going to be inundated with tropical weather in late October. Regardless, I think my introductory remarks are applicable, okay? So here we go. Argument as narrative, narrative as argument. Let's all roll up our sleeves. I like to think of October as the dog days of the fall term. The excitement of the first month of school has definitely worn off. The anticipation of the end of the term and the holiday season has yet to materialize, and you've just gotten back your midterm grades. The days are darker and colder. You are sick and you are tired. We have indeed fallen on hard times. But your courses are just beginning to pick up steam. Though the initial excitement may have worn off, you are now getting into a rhythm, finding your comfort level with your reading load and with the expectations of your professors. You're learning to write like a college student. The semester now is in full swing, painful as it may feel at times. My presentation today aims primarily to put this broad range of material in perspective for you. In your FYE courses, you bounce around among a wide range of ideas and skill sets: the Bible, Plato, Aristotle, logic, and rhetoric. How to make sense of all this stuff? Why do so many people think these classes can be lumped together in a community when things seem so different? I want to demonstrate how your course material and your learning communities are linked at a conceptual level. Basically, in the ways that your readings and writings subconsciously ask you to think of the relationship between storytelling and argumentation. Actually, we've been talking about this idea from the very beginning of the year. Anybody remember convocation? Yes. No. Who remembers our keynote speaker? Professor Duggan from the law school. Yep. Okay, what was her main point? What was the main point of her talk? Developing our own stories. Storytelling is vastly important to our lives and to our experience in college, right? The power of stories. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell each other. Storytelling, Professor Duggan reminded us, is the primary way we shape our sense of our own existence. She said the shortest distance between a human being and the truth is a story. She demonstrated this point, she argued it, by way of her own powerful story about her encounter on her travels. In other words, she argued her point about storytelling by telling you a story. Then, Dr. Lee provided a good bit of wisdom. He told you that the reason college can be very difficult is because we can't fully understand the stories that these great people we read are telling to each other. This is because we haven't yet entered their discourse community. We don't have a full sense of their vocabulary, their ways of speaking to each other. Once we acquire the fundamentals of a certain discourse community, we'll be able to partake of the stories that the community tells to itself and to each other. In that sense, we are inherently members of a discourse community. As humans, we make sense of our own existence by telling stories. This is no different from academic fields. Literature, philosophy, theology, etc. are telling each other stories that aid in making sense of their own existence. So we saw, at the very beginning of this semester, not only that argument and narrative are related, but really how important they are to each other and to you. In fact, there is an entire academic field, a discourse community, dedicated to studying this relationship. It's called narrative theory. It begins with a very basic premise. Consider this quote from the narrative theorist Peter Brooks. You probably cannot read that, but you can listen. Our lives are ceaselessly intertwined with narrative, with the stories that we tell and hear told, those we dream or imagine or would like to tell, all of which are reworked in that story of our own lives that we narrate to ourselves in an episodic, sometimes semi-conscious, but virtually uninterrupted monologue. We live immersed in narrative, recounting and reassessing the meaning of our past actions, anticipating the outcome of our future projects, situating ourselves at the intersection of several stories yet completed. The narrative impulse is as old as our oldest literature. Myth and folktale appear to be stories we recount in order to explain and understand where no other form of explanation will work. The desire and the competence to tell stories also reach back to an early stage in the individual's development, to about the age of 3, when a child begins to show the ability to put together a narrative in coherent fashion, and especially the capacity to recognize narratives, to judge their well-formedness. Children quickly become virtual Aristotelians, insisting upon any storyteller's observation of the rules, upon proper beginnings, middles, and ends. In short, Brooks reminds us of something that both Professor Duggan and Dr. Lee emphasized. We are immersed in narrative. That storytelling is an impulse innate to our humanity. But, if we think about it, we tell stories because we are making sense of our existence. We need to justify or argue why we're here and why we do what we do. In this sense, Brooks suggests, only storytelling can provide answers to such questions. But Brooks drops the name that many of you by this point have come to dread. Good old Aristotle. And for good reason. That is, Brooks dropped Aristotle's name for good reason, and you dread him for good reason. Indeed, Aristotle was one of the first to articulate the relationship between argument and narrative. So far, we've been talking about narrative. Let's pause now and discuss Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, which is the art and study of argumentation. Has anyone encountered Aristotle's definition of rhetoric in English 101 yet? You got it? What is it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought you were rhetorical question. Wow.
Close enough. Here's Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the faculty of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion. Okay, let's unpack this for a moment. First, what does Aristotle mean by the faculty of observing? I take it to mean two things. On one hand, it's the literal observation of the available means of persuasion. You can identify them when you see them, you can observe how they work in context. On the other hand, it can mean observation in the way that we actively observe things like rituals, holidays, and the like. It's the taking part of something aspect of observation that Aristotle evokes here as well. In this dual sense, observation is all-inclusive, an active engagement, both at the level of consumption and of production. Second, what does Aristotle mean by in any given case? On one hand, it suggests a well-developed faculty of observation. You can see how persuasion operates in any given context. It's a mark of your skill as a rhetorician. But this assumes, I suggest, that persuasion can, in fact, operate in any given case. That is, there is no humanly context in which some sort of persuasion is not applicable or relevant. Aristotle wants us to see that rhetoric and argument are everywhere. This is not that much different from Brooks' quote about the pervasiveness of narrative. Now, is it? It's everywhere. Our lives are immersed in it. Finally, what are the available means of persuasion? Like the discussion of any given case and available means, available means refers quite literally to whatever tools you can use to persuade someone of your point. You get the idea here? Each element of Aristotle's definition gestures towards all-inclusiveness. Since argument is present everywhere, there is a host of methods we can use to argue. Now, very generally, Aristotle identifies 3 categories of means of persuasion. Does anybody from English 101 know what these 3 general means of persuasion are? They're Greek words. Yeah. You got it. Give that man an extra 10 points on this fine. Right. Generally, very generally, ethos, pathos, and logos. The appeal to character, the appeal to emotion, and the appeal to reason. Now, in English 101, and partially in Philosophy 201, you've explored what it means to argue logically. If you commit certain fallacies, you will be less persuasive because your audience will recognize that your argument isn't making sense. But what about appealing to emotion and to character and authority? What better way to convince someone of feeling a certain way than by telling them a story? What better way to convince someone of your authority than by telling them a story? In these cases, narrative is very much an available means of persuasion. But before we make the mistake of classifying narrative as a subset of argument, a tool to be used in the process of arguing, I want to share with you James Phelan's definition of narrative. Phelan is a disciple of the Neo-Aristotelian school of narrative theory, which believes that all narrative is argumentative in nature. Here's his definition. He says, narrative can be fruitfully described as a rhetorical act, someone telling someone else on some occasion for some purpose that something happened. This seems almost laughably basic, but let's unpack this definition in the same way we unpack Aristotle's. First, someone telling someone else. In short, no narrative, or argument for that matter, is sent into a void. A teller of a tale always has an audience in mind. If narrative is a rhetorical act, the assumption, therefore, is that there is no argument without a specific audience in mind. Second, on some occasion. There is no story, and therefore there is no argument without a context. The environment in which your story is delivered will shape the nature of your audience and will provide you with certain discursive markers. For example, if you're at a funeral, you're not necessarily going to relay a dirty joke the deceased once told. Similarly, if you're delivering a toast at a wedding, you're not going to list all the ways the groom escaped the clutches of his copious ex-girlfriends. In short, the occasion shapes the narrative. Moreover, if you only have 5 minutes to speak, you're not going to deliver a 20-minute presentation. And you're not going to speak for 60 seconds when the audience is expecting a full lecture. The occasion then shapes both the content and the form of your discourse. But the most important phrase here is for some purpose. If you've got an audience and you've got a context, there is something very specific that you want to accomplish in this environment. In this sense, does a narrative truly become an argument? Every story inherently wants to persuade its audience of something. Huck Finn is an admirable boy. Odysseus is clever. Jesus is the savior of humanity. These stories demonstrate their arguments, their purpose, through narrative. Every argument and every narrative has a purpose, something that it wants to accomplish. But there is another very basic way that argument and narrative are linked. For this, we can return to Aristotle and to another laughingly basic definition. Aristotle says that every story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You don't say a beginning, a middle, and an end. Doesn't this point go without saying? What is Aristotle trying to convey here? Well, anyone who is trying to write an effective argument, or a good story for that matter, is faced with some extremely difficult questions. Namely, where do I begin? Where do I end? What do I fill the middle with? Any discourse, whether overtly argumentative or overtly narrativistic, is going nowhere until these questions are answered. Aristotle gives us clues about how to manage these questions in both storytelling and argumentation. The stories that Aristotle dealt with as an ancient Greek are along the epic and tragic lines, beginning in medias res, demonstrating a tragic flaw, ending with catharsis, etc. Arguments also go through clear stages and are even more relevant for our own contemporary purposes. Okay, English 101 people, who remembers the parts of an argument? Have you got to that point yet? Nobody has got the parts of the argument? Okay, well at least I can see the wheels turning at least. You might not have even been taught it yet, and you're still trying to remember what it was. Okay, so here it is. Here are Aristotle's parts of the argument. You begin with an introduction, you have a statement of fact, you confirm your argument, you refute your opponents, and then you conclude. That's the very basic structure. It's fluid, as you will learn, but that's the basic one, okay? But, at any rate, a clear structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like a story. If you pay attention to the way Aristotle talks about the parts of the argument, it sounds very much like a prescription for good storytelling. Only include points that are completely relevant to your audience. Don't go off on a tangent. Don't explain things with too much detail if your audience knows them already. Don't antagonize your audience by making them feel stupid. These principles apply both to arguments and to storytelling. Okay, let's see how this works with an example. I want you all to think back to early summer. Okay? You've been accepted to CUA and you've decided to go. You're excited. All of a sudden, you get this weird document in the mail. In a sense, all things, a CUA primer. What the hell is a primer? You open it. You see a list of editors, some of whom have PhD written after their names. Okay, this is probably serious. You flip the page. There is a table of contents listing some strange-looking titles. My Expectation, Teach Them to Love, Experience Beyond Need. What the hell is this thing? You flip the page. There is a preface. It's asking you to taste knowledge and digest it. Bits of knowledge, it says, are like bread, meat, and cheese that we turn into blood, tissue, and bone. Okay, now this is just disgusting. But wait, this is a metaphor, right? The mysterious framers of this document are telling you that the following selections comprise a sampler platter of ideas directed toward understanding all the things the soul can be. Wait, okay. In a sense, all things. All things the soul can be. Something is going on here. So you flip the page. How to read this book? You're telling me I don't know how to read? But wait, the metaphor continues. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Digest small bits at a time. Taste it. So before we even get to the meat, pardon the pun, of the primer, we've gotten a sense of how we are supposed to perceive it. It's been argued to us how we're supposed to encounter it. But look how it was argued to us, through a metaphor. Like the way the story uses a metaphor, right? But on with the story. You flip the page again, and now we have this weird story about a kid named Stephen, who's making a list of questions about himself and about the universe. He goes on and on about this stuff, but instead of feeling knowledgeable and empowered, he feels small and weak. Wait, that's it? Why does this primer start like this? Am I supposed to identify with Stephen? Do I, as a freshman, feel small and weak in the face of these big ideas? Ah, a clue, Watson. Well, if I don't feel small and weak, maybe I feel unnerved to the core. So the next selection, perhaps. Wait, that's even worse than small and weak. What's going on here? Why is this thing beginning with all this negativity? But you read on. Man, there's a lot of stuff in here. Math proofs, poems, cartoons. What does David Foster Wallace have to do with Euclid? Why is a passage from Toni Morrison, whoever that is, placed next to this old photograph? What does it all mean? How do I make sense of this middle? And then, after many days, you come to the end. Wait, in a sense, all things. Hey, that's the title of the primer. So who wrote this one? Oh, him again. When will he just go away? Anyway, how does it begin? It says, now, to sum up what has been said concerning the soul, let us repeat that the soul is, in a sense, all things. Oh, I get it. Aristotle said the soul is, in a sense, all things. And this primer contains, in a sense, all things. So wait, what does that say about my soul? See what's happened? I've told you a story about reading, about what happens to you when you read. You've gone through this primer, which contains all types of writing, but when they're put together, when they're arranged into a beginning, middle, and end, they very subtly and effectively make the very point that the passage at the end is trying to convey. It's through these pieces' organization that they form a coherent whole. Apart, they talk about all sorts of things. Together, they are the story of the argument of the primer. So you've done all this thinking about the relationship between narrative and argument, and you haven't even entered a university classroom. But from the very first week, the relationship rears its head again. Consider philosophy. How do narrative and argument work together in philosophy? Any general ideas? Based on what you've read and what you've done in class? What's one example of how narrative and argument work together in philosophy? How about Plato, for example? You open this book called The Republic, which, like a novel, tells the story of Socrates' experiences. Many things are discussed over the course of his dialogues with various personalities. Socrates time and again makes some very smart people look very stupid. It's a pretty fun read. Then, all of a sudden, your instructor is pestering you with all these questions about the nature of justice. Is this ringing a bell for anyone? Yes. What What point is Plato trying to make about justice? Come on. I thought we were just reading a story here. Why do we have to deal with all these annoying questions? So immediately you're dealing not only with how Plato makes a point about justice through his stories of Socrates, but he's making a point about Socrates' method. Storytelling and dialogue, in the case of Plato and Socrates, were the most effective available means of persuasion. And now in philosophy you're dealing with, you guessed it, Aristotle. In the Nicomachean Ethics, we have all these questions about what it means to be a virtuous person. We clearly see the connection to Aristotle's interest in unity. The virtuous man is the one who is able to tell himself the most coherent story about himself. If your self-narrative, in the way that Peter Brooks discussed in the quote I read to you, lines up, you have a better shot at virtue. It's all connected. And what about theology? Any theology students in here? How does narrative and argument work together in theology? You got it? No. Okay. Close enough. Wes, go ahead.
God's truth, according to the Catholic Church, is revealed through history, which is
Truth revealed through history, which is a story, right? Very cool. Okay? So here's an example that might be applicable in your FYE theological class, okay? When you study the Gospels, one of the first things you learn is that while they were intended to convey the good news about God, they are very much instances of someone telling someone else on some occasion for some purpose that something happened. That is, the evangelists had very specific audiences in mind, for whom they had a very specific persuasive purpose. The story of Jesus was going to take a certain type of shape depending on whom it was intended for. The gospel stories are, before anything else, rhetorical. And what do the gospels consist of? Very generally, the teachings of Jesus. But how, by and large, does he teach? He doesn't just come out and say, God welcomes everyone, does he? No. He has to tell you these elaborate stories about landowners who pay the same wages to people who showed up at the end of the day as to those who've been there all day, etc. Moreover, he doesn't just say, it's not the amount you donate, but the proportion of your total wealth. No, he tells the story of the woman who gave her last penny. Also, he doesn't just tell you that you have to be open to God. He tells a story about seeds that fall on different kinds of ground and how some types of ground are more suitable for growth, etc. You get the idea. A teaching is matched up with a story. What's more, most of the time the apostles don't even get the story. And then Jesus has to explain, like an exasperated teacher, what he meant. Regardless of what we take from these stories, it's clear that they're designed to be arguments. The stories make the point in themselves. They tell the story of the argument. And then we come to English. How do argument and narrative work together in English? It's the easiest one.
Back to the argument with narrative.
Hey, you got it. Back the argument with the narrative. Let's see how it works. Okay, so this is the course that most overtly asks you to examine this relationship, especially now that you approach the rhetoric portion of the course. You explore things like author and audience, literal and figurative language, metaphor and analogy. That is, concepts that inherently link argument and narrative. But this is where I come to an important point. All this conceptual talk can actually have very practical effects for you. That is, understanding the relationship between argument and narrative can help you write your papers, not only in English, but in all your subjects. For the most part, your writing assignments across the curriculum ask you to argue a point. You have to have a thesis statement and back it up with evidence, etc. What does this have to do with storytelling? I want to talk about two ways. First, you can incorporate actual storytelling into your actual papers. If you take English 101 with me, you'll read some long-form journalism. Soon enough, you realize that roughly 99% of the articles we read, articles which argue a position, begin with a story. So let's look at an example. Okay? We passed around this article by Malcolm Gladwell called Small Change. Does everyone have a copy of it? So the title of his article is Small Change, Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted. Okay? So already in the title we're getting a suggestion that he's not hot on social media as a vehicle for social change. But let's see how he works his way into this argument, okay? Here's how it begins. At 4:30 in the afternoon on Monday, February 1st, 1960, 4 college students sat down at the lunch counter at the Woolworths in downtown Williamsburg, North Carolina. They were freshmen at North Carolina A&T, a black college a mile or so away. "I'd like a cup of coffee, please," one of the 4, Ethel Blair, said to the waitress. "We don't serve Negroes here," she replied. The Woolworth's lunch counter was a long L-shaped bar that could seat 66 people, with a stand-up snack bar at one end. The seats were for whites. The snack bar was for blacks. Another employee, a black woman who worked at the steam table, approached the students and tried to warn them away. "You're acting stupid, ignorant," she said. They didn't move. Around 5:30, the front doors to the store were locked. The four still didn't move. Finally, they left by a side door. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, including a photographer from the Greensboro Record. "I'll be back tomorrow with the A&T College," one of the students said. By next morning, the protest had grown to 27 men and 4 women, most from the same dormitory as the original 4. The men were dressed in suits and ties. The students had brought their schoolwork and studied as they sat at the counter. On Wednesday, students from Greensboro's Negro Secondary School, Dudley High, joined in, and the number of protesters swelled to 80. By Thursday, the protesters numbered 300, including 3 white men from the Greensboro campus of the University of North Carolina. By Saturday, the sit-in had reached 600. People spilled out onto the street. White teenagers waved Confederate flags. Someone threw a firecracker. At noon, the A&T football team arrived. "Here comes the wrecking crew," one of the white students shouted. By the following Monday, sit-ins had spread to Winston-Salem, 25 miles away, and Durham, 50 miles away. The day after that, students at Fayetteville State Teachers College and Johnson C. Smith College in Charlotte joined in, followed on Wednesday by students at St. Augustine's College and Shaw University in Raleigh. On Thursday and Friday, the protests crossed state lines, surfacing in Hampton, Portsmouth, Virginia, in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. By the end of the month, there were sit-ins throughout the South, as far west as Texas. I asked every student I met what the first day of the sit-downs had been like on his campus, the political theorist Michael Walzer wrote in Dissent. The answer was always the same. It was like a fever. Everyone wanted to go. Some 70,000 students eventually took part. Thousands were arrested and untold thousands more radicalized. These events in the early 60s became a civil rights war that engulfed the South for the rest of the decade. And it happened without email, texting, Facebook, or Twitter. Okay? So eventually, Gladwell gets to his argument about the uses and misuses of social media. But he demonstrates the very point that he's going to make about it through this story. That is, the word of mouth and the social relationships that these students had with each other was what fermented the growth of the social movement, not the abstract and impersonal use of social networking. That's his basic point of the whole argument, and he found the perfect story to articulate that. Okay? But he works his way towards his thesis statement through another type of narrative in the next section. Let's take a look. The world, we are told, is in the midst of a revolution. The new tools of social media have reinvented social activism. With Facebook and Twitter and the like, the traditional relationship between political authority and popular will has been upended, making it easier for the powerless to collaborate, coordinate, and give voice to their concerns. When 10,000 protesters took to the streets in Moldova in the spring of 2009 to protest against their country's communist government, the action was dubbed the Twitter Revolution because of the means by which the demonstrators had been brought together. A few months after that, when student protesters rocked Tehran, the State Department took the unusual step of asking Twitter to suspend scheduled maintenance of its website because the administration didn't want such a critical organizing tool out of service at the height of the demonstrations. Without Twitter, the people of Iran would not have felt empowered and confident to stand up for freedom and democracy. Mark Feigl, a former national security advisor, later wrote, calling for Twitter to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So, he's demonstrated his counter-argument immediately through the means of a narrative about how Twitter and Facebook and whatever have been influencing social change, right? He goes straight to his counter-argument. And then he says, flipping over to the next page, I'll just read it to you. Some of this grandiosity is to be expected. Innovators tend to be solipsists. They often want to cram every stray fact and experience into their new model. As the historian Robert Darnton has written, the marvels of communication technology in the present have produced a false consciousness about the past, even a sense that communication has no history or had nothing of importance to consider before the days of television and the internet. But there is something else at work here in the outside's enthusiasm for social media. 50 years after one of the most extraordinary episodes of social upheaval in American history, we seem to have forgotten what activism is. So just having concluded the previous section with a main little thesis point, he does it again here, okay? And then look how he begins the next section. He goes right back to the Greensboro story. Greensboro in the early 1960s was the kind of place where racial insubordination was routinely met with violence. So he's bouncing around storytelling modes before he even gets to the meat of his argument. Okay, this is a technique that you yourself can use in your own writing. Okay? So, as this example demonstrates, the example of my book, using a relevant story in your introduction can create an accessible way for your audience to encounter the argument you're trying to make. You've demonstrated, the way that Gladwell demonstrated his argument, the problem at hand through a story. If we were to read the rest of this article, we'd see that Gladwell returns to this story again and again, just as we demonstrated, to reiterate his point in a new way. You can do the same thing. If you find that perfect story that articulates your point clearly, you have observed another very effective means of persuasion. Moreover, you've eliminated confusion over what to do with these pesky introductions and conclusions. In high school, your teachers probably always told you that the introduction needed to be catchy and grab the audience's attention. Well, what better way to do that than with a story? Similarly, the conclusion is supposed to wrap up or summarize your argument. But what if you return to the story you began with, to show how all the things you just learned can provide a new way of looking at it? You're using a story to illustrate your argument. The second way you can employ narrative in your papers has to do with the more abstract concepts of structure and style. One of the biggest stumbling blocks for students at your stage of development is that you don't quite know how to write in an academic style. You feel like college-level writing has to appear to be sophisticated, difficult, or even intentionally hard to understand. The anxiety to sound smart may, by and large, be a primary cause in many cases of writer's block. Moreover, with this dark cloud of style hanging over our heads, we often are faced with the conundrum I talked about earlier. Where to begin? Think of it this way. Instead of thinking of your paper in terms of structuring, or formatting, or even outlining your argument, think of yourself as telling the story of your argument. If you want your main points to unfold for your audience like a story, how might you shape it, both in terms of structure and, more importantly, in terms of style? If you want to tell a good story, you need to know just how to begin. You need to know which parts are relevant or which will go off track and bore your audience. And you need to find the perfect way that it will end. This is the same range of choices you face when you write your papers. If you're going to be a good storyteller, you need to manage the details appropriately, just like in an argument. Moreover, if you want to tell an effective story, you're not going to use overly complicated language and syntax, right? No, you're going to tell it all in plain language. Use the Gladwell as a model. He allows the style of his opening story to translate into his thesis statement and beyond. He doesn't shift into a more difficult or sophisticated style. He tells you the story of his argument. Okay, let's try this with an example. I want to ask you a question, okay? And I want you to answer it in a certain way. The question I've chosen to ask you comes from the entrance exam to All Souls College at Oxford University. Here's the summary of this exam, okay? Often described as the hardest exam in the world. The test is given over 2 days in September to recent graduates of Oxford, with winners receiving an examination fellowship of 7 years. Applicants take 4 examinations of 3 hours each, and the 2 general subject tests must answer 3 questions from a list. No more than 3 fellowships are awarded in any given year, and in some years, none are given. Last September, approximately 100 people took the exam, and 3 fellowships were awarded. So, I want to ask you a question from this list, from the hardest exam in the world, and I want you to do 2 things with it. First, I want you to come up with a 1-sentence answer to the question. This will be your thesis statement. Then, I want you to write a little story that perfectly exemplifies this thesis that you've chosen. Okay? You're going to write a 1-sentence thesis statement and then write a story that demonstrates it, just like Andy Gladwell. Okay? Are you ready for the question? I'll take that as a yes. Okay. What can we learn from Las Vegas?
What can we learn?
What can we learn from Las Vegas? Now, let's take note, though, that this is not what can we learn about Las Vegas, its population size, who's its mayor, what's its annual rainfall. No. What can we learn from Las Vegas as an idea? What can it teach us about our humanity? Okay? There's paper on the notepad. If you don't have paper, we can pass them around. Feel free to work in groups or with partners. So come up with a one-sentence statement, and then write a story, or at least come up with the notes of a story that answers the question. Okay, go ahead. Who wants to share? Okay, the guys who did not. Got it. Okay, nice amount. Sure.
All right. So our thesis statement was Las Vegas teaches us about the ugly side of humanity.
The other side of humanity.
The ugly side.
ugly side.
The ugly side.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't quite finish like the story. We only got 2 sentences deep into it. So, like, you want me to just like summarize what we did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So well, we learned about the story during football. It was, whatever. I don't know if I recorded, but there's this guy, Buster Douglas, who was a famous boxer, and he started off in Michigan, right?
Yes.
And he was fighting in like alleyways, bars, and even like little weight rooms to like become heavy champ boxing with like the entire world or whatever. So he, long story short, he beats Tyson, right? Mike Tyson in a fight in Las Vegas, and he does. They give him great. And then, whatever, Japan. So then he goes back to Las Vegas to train for his next fight to defend his heavyweight title from some guy that beat Tyson. And while he was staying in Las Vegas, the guy that was housing him at the MGM Grand, he kind of got sucked into the whole lifestyle of like, I don't know, the drugs and the, I don't want to sound messed up, but like the prostitution there, and he got really fat and didn't like train anymore, and he weighed like 450 pounds. And then like with 2 months left, he was like, I gotta fight Mike Tyson. And then, for example, he went to a sauna and charged the hotel room $100 because he was eating in the sauna while working out, and he was like ordering all this stuff there. And he basically just talks about how he gets sucked into the whole, other side of Vegas, and then he ends up losing his fight again, and then after that he stays in Las Vegas for a little longer and loses to another, bum fighter, and that was like the story we're going to talk about.
So in a sense, I mean, that's good, but in a sense, Las Vegas offered Buster Douglas the heights and the depths of humanity.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. Other two things that want to share? Yeah, trust people want to share. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead, Wes. Nice one.
Our thesis was that a super stylized outside can not only mask but corrupt the soul.
Okay.
And so, well,
Super stylized mask. The super stylized exterior can only
mask
corrupt the soul.
So the first thing we came up with was, if any of you know the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, but since that was already written, we're going to go with it. So then we have the story about a charlatan who dresses up as a monk. He lives in a very northern part of Europe, and he knocks on the royal palace and falls prostrate before the queen and says, I've had a great vision. And he starts wailing and flailing about, and the queen takes him in and starts to ask him about his visions and about the prophecies he's hearing from God, and he puts on this elaborate show, and he wears these long, elegant robes and has these pendants that evoke religious symbols, and eventually what happens is the people of this country get so annoyed that the queen is listening to this monk that they start a revolution. When, in all earnest, the monk was just a charlatan that had just waltzed his way into the palace. And,
All this attendance.
yeah.
That's good. So you took the allegorical route, right? The story wasn't about Las Vegas per se. It plays Las Vegas, but it was in an allegorical sense. The philosophical problem of Las Vegas. That's fantastic. Anybody else want to share? Okay, humanities group, go ahead.
Ours was don't be deceived by false promises.
Sure.
Okay, story would be, don't laugh at me. Okay, so there was a young man walking through a casino, and he's looking at all these really big fancy slot machines that have win big or big win $1 million, $1 gets you $1 million, and all this stuff. And he's just thinking like, wow, this would be really great. I wonder if it really works. So it's just like $1 and you get $1 million and break the bank. So he only has $1 left on him, and he puts that in a slot machine. And Jose starts praying, and then it's a small ticket says, "Oh, you only get 75 cents." And so, kind of a big lesson there. You don't always win big.
No, that's good, because the idea, the philosophical idea of false promise is very interesting, right? And in Vegas doesn't necessarily promise you anything, right? It suggests things to you. But that's a good example of that, right? He received the power of suggestion from the slot machine. Very good. Bill, did I see your hand up?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Arthur came up with our vice can lead us to transcend the will of nature.
Say again.
Our vice can lead us to transcend the will of nature.
Okay.
So we came up with the desert where you have 100-degree days and 30-degree nights and literally no water. And yet we decided to live there and stay there because of our vice, sex, and gambling. And then to develop that, we go through the story of the Hoover Dam and the solar fields and how they built those, all just to sustain that one city. And then it's kind of ironic that we call it Las Vegas, the meadows, an image in nature.
That's great. You went with the history roots, right? To demonstrate how we try to conquer nature to no avail. To no avail, even though we ironically insert natural imagery into its own play. Unless anybody else has any other stories they want to share. Failed point. No, it's fine. He's been reluctant to speak on that. I'm very grateful that you guys came and participated the way that you did. I hope that you were able to gain some more insight about how argument and narrative work together, not only in your FYE courses, not only in your university courses in general, but in all aspects of your life. I mean, if anything, we saw that it's all pervasive. But also in your writing. Anytime you write something, you have to engage both aspects, no matter what kind of writing you're doing, okay? So unless Mr. Fail needs you to do anything, thank you very much. I'll see you